I'm going to assume at this point that you've already had a chance to read the poem, Sir Gawain or Gawain, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it as much as I enjoy it, or at least enjoy, even if you enjoyed half as much as I do. I think that that would be a lot because I thoroughly enjoy it. I enjoy the poetry of it as a someone who writes poetry myself. I just revel in the language of it, and I want to talk about the language specifically in this session, which we've not had a chance to do a lot because we've been dealing in translation. And it's true, we're still kind of dealing in translation, but we're not quite so far removed. We're having what some people call light translation, where you can where they essentially try to treat the original and modernize the words and get kind of the flavor of the original. We're not so far removed actually from the actual text that we begin to get a flavor of how the text might have sounded. Whoever this author is was a brilliant, brilliant poet, somebody who clearly was a mastery at the sounds of words, and not just a mastery of storytelling. And although we probably assume that the story that he or she is telling is one that had been passed down for some time, but uh, that this person, whoever this is, seemed to revel in the musicality of it, which is very typical for the region, as we got from the Simon Armitage video. And I want to just focus on it just for just a quick moment. Here is a wonderful English modernized version of it. This is the beginning. It starts off at Christmas, it's seeming like it's going to be just a wonderful description of Christmas in Camelot, and we get, I mean, in some ways, more than we want of the descriptions of what Camelot looks like, what the decorations are like, what foods they're having, what the entertainment is like. But I want you to notice a couple of things that are relevant about the beginning of the poem. Right here, it begins, after the siege and the assault had been exhausted at Troy. So in other words, this is already going to take us all the way back to the Iliad, to the time of the Trojan War. And this is not, though, going to be looking at it from the perspective of the Greeks. It's not the perspective that you're going to get from the Odyssey, but rather this is something that's going to be more along the lines of the Roman version, because Virgil, the great poet Virgil, will write his own sequel in which he will account for the ending of the war. The ending of the war is the same, so the war itself doesn't change a lot, but in his account, of course, the Greeks win. They use the horse to get in there, to sack the city. They burn the city down. They take the women and the young ladies with them as slaves, mostly as sex slaves. And the men, they brutally kill, including the king himself, which is terribly described by Virgil. And then the little babies and little children, they just toss off the walls to get rid of them, because that's kind of an annoyance, really. We need to do something with all these children. So the author here is trying to connect this Arthur story all the way back to the central myth of Rome and the central myth of Greece. So this is a marvelous thing that he's doing, trying to say, hey, in this same tradition comes the Arthur legend and this particular story. So he says, after the siege and assault had been exhausted at Troy. Here, the repetition of those consonants, especially you'll see it in this line, and the city had been broken to bits and burnt to brands and ashes. Oh, I love that. It's difficult not to read that and delight in it. The man that wrought that tragedy by means of his treasonous works was brought to trial for treachery, truly the worst in the world. Who could that be, by the way? Who could be the traitor, the one who ended the war with a treasonous act? Well, he's speaking of Odysseus. Odysseus, in the Roman tradition, is the bad guy by using the art of treason. What is the art of treason in the Trojan horse? Isn't all's fair in love and war? No, not in the rule of Xenia, where you offer a gift, but it turns out the gift is actually the means by which they're all going to be slaughtered or taken as slaves. This is taking Xenia and turning it on its head. It's actually taking advantage of the Trojans with Xenia. I guess one could make that argument with Odysseus, and certainly the Romans do, because the Romans will argue, again, as I've said, historically not true, but the Romans sure believe it, that the Trojans are their great ancestors, and that what will happen is that while Troy is being destroyed, one man named Aeneas will escape the city with his family, with his father, with a few other people, and they will escape, and they will manage to set sail and get out of the way of the Greeks. And then Aeneas will go on a journey very much like the Odyssey. Some have even laughed that the Iliad is very much a copy of the Odyssey, only with Aeneas as the hero. But the ultimate goal is not to get home, it's to find a home. And Aeneas will find a home in what will become Rome. And he will then become, I believe, the grandfather of Remus and Romulus, who will found Rome. None of that is true, but the Romans sure love that story, because if you're going to tell a story about your ancestors being treated poorly, that seems to give you some sort of license to, when you get more powerful, to go and, well, just to annihilate all those people that mistreated your ancestors. Never a good idea to live in the past in that way, but it's very effective propaganda. So getting back to the story here, though, it was Aeneas, the nobleman, and his high and mighty kin, his high and mighty family, who later oppressed many provinces, becoming overlords of well nigh all the wealth in the islands that lie away to the west. In other words, Aeneas is going to be the one who ultimately gains power. After that, Romulus, rich in rank, rushed swiftly off to Rome. He was the first with pomp and pride to build that city up. Oh, I just love that. And he named it from his own name, which now the place still bears. So we're going to begin with the connection to the Iliad. And then each stanza, notice, ends with this wonderful little refrain. And clearly it's meant to be sung, as epics often are. And these often have this wonderful rhyming scheme: to war and woe and wonder, by turns we have been fated, and here both bliss and blunder have flourished or abated. So I just wanted to point that out, and I hope you are noticing the delicious language. If any of you are poets, this is very good exercise to read this aloud. And if you're not a poet and you don't even like poetry, read this aloud. You'll just notice it feels good in the mouth. One of the interesting aspects, though, of mythology that I think is worth noting is, and which we have talked about, is that myths often become difficult to separate from the culture and the culture from the myths. But it's easy to see how the myths themselves ultimately create a society. And one of the purposes, I believe, of the Arthur legends, the Arthur myths, is to reinforce what's going on there in Europe and all the way into England at this time. And that is the feudal society, the society where you have at the center of a city state, you have a castle in which a lord will live, and that lord is the landowner, and that landowner or a knight is called on by God to be a protector of those who are going to work the fields and work the little town. But the Lord is essentially a small king. And he hires the clergy, he hires the blacksmith, he hires those who work the field. He doesn't just hire them, they belong to him. Not as slaves, technically, because they would say, oh, slavery is abhorrent, but as serfs. And so you don't really get away from it. It's difficult to imagine doing that. And even some lords would punish a serf or a worker who would try to leave. The story here, of course, is trying to reinforce the nobility of the landowners, the nobility of the knights. And I don't mean this in a negative way at all, because I love these stories. But remember that part of the point is that it helps to reinforce among the landowners that they have a responsibility to be good citizens, to be good caretakers, and to be upright and moral. These stories, of course, would also be told orally to the people who would live and work, out in the fields and in the little towns. And they also, I think, would help to reinforce this idea of the Lord or the knight being good. Our myths help us to create who we are. And so I want you to read these and think about this. How, in many ways, is this different from what we've been reading with the Greeks, what we've been reading with the Romans? Because it's easier the closer we get to ourselves, we can see how our myths really do emphasize what's important. We can see with the old myths, Xenia, how that seems to be reinforcing that. And we begin to see now, as we come into medieval Europe, that the idea of chivalry and a moral leadership becomes more and more important. How this is interesting is I'm going to ask you to do something for me in the last session. There won't be a video attached to it of me. It's going to be of, I want to discuss, well, it will have of me, but I want you to read before you watch that, a video that I'm going to post that has the wife of Bath's tale. Because coming out of the medieval period, something's going to begin to change. And we're going to begin to find people being cynical about this feudal life, cynical about the idea of whether or not the knights are actually as moral as they are supposed to be. And we're going to see a story from Geoffrey Chaucer in which he completely takes the idea that we're reading here in Sir Gawain, and he's going to mock it. Dare I say it, it's really kind of the first popular spoof in English. And so I'm going to ask you to read that and make some comments on that. So that will be session 4. I've got a question here, though, for session 3, and then we'll move on to session 4. Hey, thanks so much.